Okay, so they took all the yard out? Same thing. Oh, yeah.
No, but it's okay.
Yeah. Oh, just like have you I'll go to the other room.
Bonjour. Ça va? Ça va?
Take. 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 Take.
Oh, this one's louder.
Take. Take. Take.
You good?
Right, it's building the beats and stuff. Right, so that's what the idea is. So our entry source is because what we had to do was, we set it, and it was that on the way. That's all the first records. Hopefully it doesn't happen. So I was talking about it, I just told Andrew exactly, he just went to that little system. Let me see over here. I can maybe do it real fast. So it's only when they change their things, right? When they change their, right, okay.
Oh, is that?
Well, no, the problem that we had yesterday was this little guy, right? And then we went into the box, and we switched out we put the one that has the white tape on it, put that in there, and it worked fine. It's just been touchy. Let's put this back to full screen, right? Is this it? Okay. And I had to get this guy. So yeah, you did see that. So after it stopped, it was so for some reason, it seems to have it's the box. Yeah, definitely. It's something that what we do, it's always initially, you set it up, and you just wiggle any of those cables and go. That's it, it's the box. Yeah. But Dave, you have to do anything being done.
So, when you go into the school,
Because I left everything all I did was put one mic on the table. And I guess you put the mics back up.
Oh, no, I did. But I guess he took it.
while my shoot ends at 7:30, So, well, how old are you working here? That's true. Very well.
That's a good floor. Kind of there. And then what else? So this is from 4 till exactly. And we'll let the corner house go and it goes up to 4.
Okay,
Did you get the order?
No.
I'm thinking, I want to talk to you about it, so I did another session. And so I want to just space so that I so that's the main thing I'm working on, all this pressures. And talking about I did notice that, so you said, there's a bunch of areas where we have to working on being able to consistently our branding message. Like just as an example, there's a Facebook page. So that means I have been keeping it on that stuff. Just wondering correct. Oh, okay. You have the right to speak. Okay, that means I should be able to keep that. Yeah, I'll do that. Yeah, I have made accounts, it's all written down, or at least I think it's all written down. I made accounts for Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, plus YouTube, Gmail. That's all this is. Submission, and of course the website. That should all be. Well, you know what, like I said before, it certainly doesn't hurt to say, in terms of right now, most of the like, we have to rewrite the page, and as far as that goes, I honestly think and that's just not a bad idea, but we really just kind of present whatever there is. It's okay for us to say, as far as like more details, the urgent thing is, within all of us, is we have to have some sort of understanding of exactly how it is. And the next major thing after we are straightened out is actually to sit down and test out the whole system. Yeah, I think that I have at least a half dozen decent excerpts from last night that could be sent. Yeah, the whole, I think we have to use whatever. I know it's not a lot of time. However, I have, some ideas of what I would like to do. Tomorrow I pick up Ezra in the morning. Okay, great.
Oh, okay.
You made me household for a moment.
I guess we have to turn on speaker.
I'm gonna try and work on this weekend and then next week. It's a week from this from this Friday.
Oh, sure, yeah, I'm gonna put this watch here, but yeah, signal will be good too. It doesn't matter. Okay.
Oh, so
We're a little under. Okay.
I'm just really excited. I'm excited about the council. I'm gonna do my first like. I'm gonna have like. Yes. Helps English sound. I mean it is.
thought that's a great idea.
Oh, really? Oh, that was interesting. I'm not sure. I did, but yeah, it must have been a mistake on my part.
So,
Not that honest.
Sit her without blocking your way. You see over me?
Sure, that's fine. Yeah, oh, it's at the beginning there, right? Yeah, the first line there.
Because it's not italics, I don't read this.
Yeah, no, I understand. Oh, cool.
okay, this was like,
No, I think that's
that was what you're actually like, but it's like a sign that you propose on. Sort of like people who are cashing out. Involved in the process of one here. But anyway, so I'm still working on that. He was a
Good afternoon, and welcome to the third session of our conference on the invasive other. Glad you're all here. I hope you had a chance to do some of you yesterday with the two, I think, quite extraordinary panel discussions we had then. And today we have three. We have the panel right now on ideas, and then on invasive ecologies, and then at 6 o'clock this evening, we have Roger and Michael Nadia giving us our closing and keynote address. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dominic Petman, who I'm sort of astonished to say I've really met he's my colleague here at the New School, and we literally met today. I mean, which is quite a happy idea that we've been together and haven't met until now, but I'm very pleased to meet him. Dominic is chair of the Liberal Studies program at the New School for Social Research and professor of culture and media at our Eugene Lang College. He has published a great deal, many books, and his most recent are Infinite Distraction, Paying Attention to Social Media, and a forthcoming book called Creaturely Love, How Desire Makes Us More and Less Than Human. It's a kind of tantalizing title. It's my pleasure now to turn it over to Dominic.
Thank you very much. So welcome all to the New School and to this conference. As was just said, I do teach culture and media, so it's very difficult to have a class without social media becoming front and center, no matter what the theme. This is our mode of communication these days. So if that's, the content can vary widely, of course, but this is the paradigmatic form of our age. And so the attendant metaphors of things going viral, etc. I'm sure will be one of the main topics today. My book on distraction, I'm thinking of the theme of invasion and how the generation gaps, even the people diving into their phones, especially the young, there's some strange parallel of the invasion of the body snatchers going on. There's this discourse about we have to get everybody's heads out of their phones, and that we're surrounded by pod people. And it's hard not to think that, and it's not even by age when you look around the subway platform. Just sort of been captured by these devices, and today we'll be talking about ideas, but invasive. But it's fine. I lost my train of thought. Anyway, so yes, the technology itself, the vectors itself, the modes of transmission themselves as being a form of invasion might be an interesting way to look at this. According to the most general axis, we have time. So if we're going to define an invasion or refute the definition of an invasion, that's often to do with at what point in history we decide something is indigenous or not, or immune or not. And of course, space. With ideas, maybe what plays the role of territory is the mind. So the polis of the mind, the territory of the mind. If you're going to be practicing digital hygiene, one of these phrases out there, then where is the boundary? Is it the body? Is it the mind? Is it the soul? Where is this shifting, blurring membrane between yourself and an idea? And this is another thing I hope we get to a little bit, is what counts as an idea, as opposed to just, say, a unit of information or a meme or something like that. In the late 17th century, early 18th century, we had the Earl of Shaftesbury, who wrote a letter called Concerning Enthusiasm. And he writes about religious manias and panics, and what today we might even call moral panics, and how these have a social and communicative aspect. But again, it's not the question of form versus content is something to bear in mind in this context, because is a panic an idea? Is an enthusiasm an idea? Can it just be a kind of a mode or vector or a mood even of transmission? And very different ideas can be located, identified within that. So that's a very, very broad frame for today, and I'm not sure even how relevant it might be, but hopefully there's some connection there. So I'd like to introduce our three esteemed speakers who will be talking about the invasion of ideas. I'll introduce them all now. We'll have the three papers in a row so we can figure out the resonances between them, and then I'll throw open some questions. So first will be Dr. Agnès Kalmar, who's the director of Columbia University Global Freedom of Expression, an initiative seeking to advance understanding on global freedom of expression, and special advisor to the president of Columbia University, First Amendment scholar Lee Bollinger. She spent 9 years as the executive director of Article 19, the international human rights organization promoting and defending freedom of expression and access to information. Prior to this, Dr. Kalmar was chef de cabinet for the Secretary General of Amnesty International and their research policy coordination. And she has advised senior levels of multilateral organizations and governments around the world, and led human rights investigations in more than 30 countries. Dr. Kalmar has published broadly in the fields of human rights, women's rights, refugee movements, and accountability, and in fact holds a PhD in political science from the New School in social research. So the prodigal daughter. Then we have Mark Rottenberg, who is the president of EPIC, the Electronic Privacy Information Center in Washington, D.C. He teaches information privacy and open government at Georgetown Law. His work focuses on emerging privacy and civil liberties issues, and has litigated cases concerning airport body scanners, NSA surveillance, consumer privacy, government secrecy, and drone surveillance. Recent publications include Privacy in the Modern Age, The Search for Solutions, which is the new press of last year, and with Anita Allen, Privacy, Law, and Society, which is this year. And finally, last but not least, we have Jacob Silverman, who is a contributing editor for The Baffler, and his work has appeared in the LA Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post. And his recent book, I Need to Read, Terms of Service, Social Media, and the Price of Constant Connection. So please welcome our panelists today, and we'll start with Andy.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can see me behind that big platform. It's a pleasure to be here and to share with you some of my reflection on the topic that we're going to debate, which is the invasion of ideas. I will focus on what may constitute invasion in the digital era. I will focus less on what constitutes an idea, but we've already heard some thought about it. And I will look at a few examples to illustrate my thinking. Look at terrorism and ideas of terrorism that are being circulated through the digital means. I will look at the right to be forgotten as an idea, and more generally at human rights norm, very briefly because time will be running out based on the work I'm doing right now. And then I will conclude with some thought based on those three examples. So these were originally the three questions I asked myself when I was approached to contribute to this discussion. How much has the digital world transformed the world of ideas? How much did it transform the notion of invasion and invasive ideas? What are the invasive ideas of the digital 21st century, and how different are they from the non-digital world? And equally important, how did the digital world transform, expand, or restrict the way invasive ideas are policed or controlled? So I won't get with in all those questions because time will be running out, but just to give you an idea of my thought process. Before going into the first example, I wanted to highlight the fact that historically the ideas have always been controlled and policed. Of course, this is as central to state and society as the nature of governance itself. The debate around freedom of expression has always been a debate about what needs to be controlled and what kind of expression, what kind of ideas should be limited. And that debate has historically been framed as well around which ideas are not domestic, which ideas are not native, which ideas are not ours. Basically, which ideas do not respond to our way of being and our way of doing. So the idea of invasion and invasive ideas is quite central to the thinking and the practice around freedom of expression. I'm currently looking back again at the travaux préparatoires for the UDHR and the ICCPR, and it is very striking how much the notion of some ideas being invasive and having to be controlled is present there. On one hand, the Soviet Union at the time is looking at fascism as a form of invasive ideas that we ought to be protected against, and it's very central to the travaux préparatoires for the international human rights system. And on the other hand, you have the Western Bloc trying to protect itself against communist ideas coming partly from outside, but also from within. Their tactics are very different, and maybe in conclusion I will go back to that. So ideas have got to be, need to be controlled, need to be restricted. This is the purpose of regulations around freedom of expression. And from the Second World War onwards, a number of international instruments have been established to determine which ideas need to be limited. And you have a range of international provisions under the human rights regime that seek to restrict freedom of expression. The most important one is Article 19 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, which determine that some ideas may be restricted if they have an impact on the respect of the rights or reputation of others, or indeed an impact on national security. I mean, it's phrased much more nicely than that. Ideas got to be restricted if they amount to propaganda of war, and if they amount to advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitute incitement. Ideas that amount to incitement to genocide must be restricted as well. A lot of ideas related to the right to equality and non-discrimination ought to be restricted. At least that's the international legal framework. So all of this to say that internationally ideas, including ideas coming from outside or perceived as coming from outside or constructed as coming from outside, have always been the object of limitation by the state and through the state. Still, the digital world has radically or somehow radically transformed the state of affairs. So let's begin with the first example, which is very, very present in our daily life, which is violent extremism, terrorism, violent radicalization, incitement to terrorism, and so on and so forth. I just wanted to give you some ideas of what I am talking about here. So these are a succession of examples that's mostly from tweet accounts that are supposedly, allegedly amounting to the propagation of violent radical ideas. So I'm not going to get and try to analyze them all, but this is this one here is the main newspaper that ISIS is putting out on a regular basis related to its ideology and propaganda. You can access it online. So plenty of examples of the use of social media by terrorist groups. I'm putting it in quotation marks, but I'm not going to use the word quotation every time. Just put it that it's my way of saying that there is no definition of what I'm talking about. So plenty of examples of ideas of terrorism, ideas described as amounting to violent extremisms being circulated via the digital world, and in particular via the social media, with a particular focus on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and more recently Telegram as well. So these are the means of communication. The size of the audience itself is difficult to assess. There was a recent attempt to close down all of the Twitter accounts which amounted to, or which were characterized as being an ISIS propaganda accounts. Most of them had no more than hundreds followers at a time. Still, there were quite a few of those accounts, but just to say that each account is not extremely popular. And the messengers themselves, there are a few messengers that are well known, but the majority are anonymous. That's how, just very briefly, how some of those things are communicated. So how has the state so to respond and to control these ideals. They've sought to disrupt the message through a focus on the technology, to counter the message through counter speech, and to target the messengers through legal means. Disrupting the technology and the message, I think we may speak quite a lot about it. This is very specific, of course, to the digital era, and it's from takedown of websites to denial of service to a range of technical means that are at our disposal to try to control those ideas from reaching out to a certain audience. With more or less success, and we can return to that, but I think it's important to highlight the fact that there are specific means that were not, of course, part of the panoply of responses and the censorship system in place before the digital era. Counter speech is the attempt to countering those bad ideas, those invasive ideas, by providing an alternative to that speech. And I'll return to that in the conclusion, but what's probably interesting for our purpose is that the counter speech is being built as a speech from within, and the terrorist speech, the radical speech, is constructed as a speech coming from outside. And you will see that a lot if you analyze the various official discourse around it. So these are some examples of counter speech. Some being driven by the state, others being more civil society driven, with, in my view, limited impact so far, but it needs to be continued. I want to spend a bit more time on the legal responses to these invasive ideas that are terrorism. What we have seen in response to not only the act of terrorism, but the propaganda, or what is being termed the propaganda, we have seen a multiplication of legal instruments coming out, starting with new laws being adopted around cybersecurity, but not only, and all the way to the prosecution of some of the messengers, and new policies around the use of internet for the propagation of terrorism. So that's the work I do in particular. I'm looking at how those legal responses are being constructed. And here is a little summary of the key finding. There is a quasi-global consolidation of national security as a legal and judicial framework as far as speech ideas are concerned. In my view, the result is a very broad and confusing legal area. There are broad, vaguely defined concepts and offenses, the granting of broad discretionary powers, and poorly argued jurisprudence most of the time. So what you are witnessing is the legal response is shifting from a focus on incitement and a nexus between the speech and the violence to a focus on the idea itself, independently of its potential for a violent act. So the nexus between the idea and the act has kind of disappeared over the last, I would say, 3 or 4 years, a little bit more here around 9/11. What you are also seeing is a multiplication of new charges that are related to the protection of national security against those ideas which are, again, not ideas with a potential for a violent action. They are just ideas we don't like. The potential for actions is actually very, very little investigated. And so the result is that, of course, not in Western democracies, at least until now, the result is that around the world, this expansion of the ideas that can be targeted means that people like the one you're seeing here, who is a very well-known Turkish journalist, is being accused of incitement to terrorism and actually propaganda, I think. And so are they. Those three people are academics in Turkey who have signed petitions against the human rights violations in Kurdistan, in the Kurdish part of Turkey. And they are all also facing, in fact, they are all in jail at the moment, accused of a charge with charges related to the petition itself, the idea that the petition had carried, which was not an idea of violence, which was not an idea of linking a potential, the idea with violence, but it was, in fact, questioning the use of violence by the state. So like I said, we are moving away from the causal link to violence, and we are seeing an increased focus on the perceived ideological and religious roots of terrorism, and that's a very big shift that you can see, including in this country, where, of course, the First Amendment should protect against that move, but that's happening, and that's the US Patriot Act has allowed that to happen, but it's actually a global phenomenon. You must have heard about what the Turkish president has said recently around you cannot distinguish between a terrorist holding a gun and somebody just having a pen. And that to me is very reflective of what's happening to ideas that we don't like at the moment. Okay, so the focus is on extremism or on terrorism as a body of expressed thought and belief. And that's a major shift, and on extremists as deviant from mainstream and accepted social norms. Not because of what they may do, but because of what they think and may express. Even if there is no relationship, even if the link between what they say and the potential act of violence is not demonstrated. So this is an example, I mean, a very interesting example. It's a French example where this boy is 3-year-old. His mother and his uncle were sentenced to 6 months suspended jail for the t-shirt he's wearing. That t-shirt was seen by 2 persons, the school teacher and the school director. Okay, I won't get into the details because it's too much, and I think I'm maybe running out of time. Just to say that some have argued, I think it may be a bit much, but some have argued that what we're seeing right now is a form of preventive prosecution around ideas. That is defined as a policy posture involving aggressive employment of material support and conspiracies law to enable arrest without having to await the emergence of a specific plot. I think there may be evidence to it, actually. I didn't investigate that too much. What I did investigate is that in Europe, for instance, what you are saying in response to the invasive radical ideas is a focus on social cohesion within us, the political discourse and the legal discourse. So courts in particular, including at the European level, European Court, will argue their case around whether or not the ideas is a threat to the social cohesion. That's not completely new, but the way it's being used at the moment is certainly far more present in the jurisprudence than it has been so far. So for instance, wearing the niqab, which is a French case, which went to the European Court, and the European Court had actually really took their time to look at how bad that idea of wearing the niqab was. And they eventually concluded that it's not a question of security, it's not a question of women's empowerment and so on, it's a question of social cohesion, which I thought was very interesting if we look at what we are discussing today. Okay, well, that was for my first example. I'll just briefly look at the right to be forgotten. I don't know if you know about what it means, what it is. Am I speaking to an audience that knows? All right, so the right to be forgotten began, not really, but the first step is in Luxembourg. It's a European Court of Justice case, where basically the court has determined that an individual, a Spanish man in that case, had a right to be forgotten, meaning he could be de-indexed from all Google searches. That, here what I want to say, that this case came up in March 2014, so it's very recent, it's basically 2 years. And in the space of 2 years, that case has actually gone on a world trip, which you don't find very often. So I'm just showing that to you, how the jurisprudence of that case has gone and how it is resulting now in a fairly large map where the idea of being the right to be forgotten, which is an idea in and by itself, has become more anchored in many countries around the world. Not in the United States, but certainly in Canada. And this idea is now getting into a third stage, which is very interesting for, again, the invasion purposes. The third stage is that the de-indexation has got to be global. Originally, the de-indexation was only to be done on google.fr or google.canada. But recently, the French regulator agency and the Canadian court have said this makes no sense. If there is a valid right, a claim, if the claim to be de-indexed is valid, then it should become a global claim. It cannot just be restricted to google.fr and google.canada. By so doing, what is very interesting is that basically both France and Canada have created an extraterritorial reach of their own idea, which is an idea that there is a right to be forgotten, against, some have claimed, the extraterritorial arm of US culture, which was embodied by Google. Just a third example, which is a very recent analysis I've done on all the cases I've analyzed in 2015 regarding freedom of expression. And I was in particular looking at how many of the lawyers, how many of the court decisions made reference to ideas outside their jurisdictions, meaning to jurisprudence or laws or standards that came from outside the national jurisdictions. And you can find here that 19% in total, but that hides a great deal of differences. Though here, North America, the little green is Canada, basically. But none of the American jurisprudence is making reference to non-American jurisprudence. But look how that compares to Europe, where you have about 35% of all decisions making reference to non-European jurisprudence. And Africa is very large. So it's a continent which at legal and court level is very integrated within its legal global context, something I guess that the US Supreme Court Judge Stephen Breyer will be very happy with. I don't know what happened. Oh, yeah, that's another global journey I wanted to show you, but time is running out. That's New York Times versus Sullivan, to show you how ideas can travel and can become foreign and invasive, but those ones are, of course, from my standpoint, benevolent. So this is clearly a little, okay. Very quickly, because I think I'm way over my time now, the concluding remark. So, the internet world has, to a large extent, created a post-Westphalian world. It has, technology accounts for the transboundary and geography-defying quality of our world. And the human agency's interaction with that technology has solidified its geography-defying reach. So the state was originally not one of the agencies that were part of the new digital world. That's why it was described as post-Westphalian. So there were other actors involved. The technology was absolutely crucial. For some scholars, the users is the actor that played a crucial role in building that post-Westphalian world. For others, it's a transnational institution. For others, yet again, it is the corporation. So we were all living in this very lovely world, post-Westphalian, until summer 2013. Do you know what happened then? Yeah. So what happened in summer 2013 is Edward Snowden revelation. I did not have the time to put a photo of Edward Snowden, but you know all what he looks like. And his revelation points to the returning force of the state, seeking to assert control over what had been thought as the ungovernable internet. From my standpoint, I have to say that the centrality of the state to internet regulation and to the regulation of ideas on internet is not quite as new as some observers may believe. Already in 2006, I just want to quote Lessing, who is a very well-known, respected thinker around digital ideas. And he said the first generation of the architect was built by a non-commercial sector, the second generation was built by commerce, and the third, not yet off the drawing board, could well be the product of government. So that was in 2006. As a human rights activist, as it has been highlighted, working in the field of freedom of expression over the last 10 years, I have to say, to me, the state has always been quite central. The Chinese firewall is an example, but not only, there's been multiplication of laws for at least 10, 15 years related to the control of ideas on internet. So, so in the field of ideas and in the digital era, the notions of geography and sovereignty have not disappeared. They've transformed, but not disappeared. They've been recreated for the purpose of digital control and digital policing. Indeed, these notions are central to the digital world. Just to give you the example of internet sovereignty, which is one of China norm that it's trying to sell on the international circuit, with actually far too much success for my own taste than some would believe. But the notion of invasive ideas does not just apply to something that will be geographically defined as China is trying to push for. The territories through which ideas navigate are not only defined geographically or by the state, and I think you were hinting to that. Possibly very specific to the digital era, the definition of what constitutes invasive may simply mean what you, as an individual user, does not want to see. In the field of ideas, invasion can be policed individually. Both benevolent and malevolent ideas can be quite easily ignored. The internet does function as an echo chamber, if you want it to function as such. On Facebook, your friends may just all think and post like you. On Twitter, you can follow people who think like you. You may consult websites and watch videos that validate your views. Individual choices include the choice to close your mind, the internet revolution can and should open your mind to other realities, but it can as easily shrink it. And so here the invasive ideas are ideas you simply don't like. And for the first time in history, you have the means very easily to just create your own world around those ideas. There is plenty of evidence that the internet assists in the creation of international virtual communities. So people across national boundaries create communities of interest and ideas, spreading such ideas, some emancipatory, some not so much. And so the internet allows individuals and groups to link to one another, both electronically and logistically, even geographically isolated people. So what you have through in the digital era, as far as ideas are concerned, is the construction of a community of ideas, community of people joined by similar ideas, but that community is not defined geographically. It's defined because of the ideas they have in common, the interests they have in common. And that is partly why it's so difficult to counter radicalization online. The concept of digital natives is something that we can elaborate upon. We should conclude just to say that I think maybe the other speakers will get into that. The policing is not just done by the state or by you, it's done by private corporation, and we may go back to that in maybe the terms of services. In conclusion, though, I say there is one thing that has not changed, and the historical pattern of an idea being labeled invasive because it's an idea that disturbs, that is still very much present in the digital era. Not because they originate from outside, but simply because we don't like them, simply because they disturb. They are the handmaiden of power, without which power is inconceivable. The control is an instrument to assist in the attainment, preservation, or continuation of somebody's power, whether exercised by an individual, an institution, or a state. That was there 2 centuries ago, 5 centuries ago, and it's certainly still here now. Thank you very much.
So next we have Mark.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Mark Rotenberg. I'm director of the Electronic Privacy Information Center. We were established more than 20 years ago, actually, to focus public attention on emerging privacy issues. But we're also very interested in finding solutions to emerging privacy issues. That was, in fact, the theme of our recent book for the New Press, Privacy in the Modern Age, The Search for Solutions. I apologize, I don't have slides today, but I do want to call your attention to the image on the book jacket. We somewhat purposefully crafted an image that combined both the elements of the digital age, of the zeros and the ones, but also social protest. And you'll see that there's a raised hand. And we did this to begin a conversation about how we confront and challenge new technologies, that we need not accept a technological imperative that technology necessarily enters our lives. And so I was very pleased to have the invitation to speak with you at a conference on the theme of the invasive other. Among the many topics we've explored over the last several years has been the growing presence of drones in the United States. And so I'm going to talk about drones today. They're non-military use. The military use of drones is a critically important topic, but it's not the focus of my comments. I'm going to talk about the deployment of drones in the United States, and I'm going to do this in 4 parts. I'm going to tell you first a bit about the technology of drones, what you need to know, a bit about the public policy implications, how we're beginning to discuss, assess, and evaluate drones in the United States. I'll share with you a fairly complex litigation strategy that EPIC has pursued over the last several years. We have multiple cases concerning drone surveillance. And finally, my goal is to fully engage the conference topic about the invasive other and raise the question, can we coexist with drones? What does it mean to live in a world of semi-autonomous devices, drones and robots and other types of technologies that begin to interact with us with their own purposes and consequences? Let's begin with a few words about what drones are. They are essentially aerial vehicles designed to operate without a human pilot. They typically carry sophisticated recording devices. In fact, it is almost a unique feature of a drone that will have a camera. This is not necessarily true for most aircraft. You can have prop busters, helicopters, model rockets, all sorts of things that you might send into the air. They don't require cameras. Drones typically do. There's a great interest in the commercial deployment of drones in the United States. According to one report, there are more than 500,000 commercial drones in the U.S. by the end of 2014, and that number is expected to increase for the foreseeable future at the rate of 15 to 20% a year. In the next couple of years, we will have more than 1 million commercial drones operating in the United States. What are their uses? Well, of course, you've heard about some of the commercial applications. Perhaps Amazon will be delivering boxes to your doorstep with a drone. Journalists have talked about the use of drones to do investigation and oversight. Environmentalists are exploring the use of drones. There are even public safety applications, substituting drones for first responders. But the privacy and public safety issues are substantial as well. The drone technology is vulnerable to interception. The drone surveillance capabilities are not simply video, they're audio, they intercept electronic communication, they can do human identification at a distance, they can determine heat signatures within inside a home. Policy dimensions of drones have fallen so far into roughly 3 categories: public safety, privacy, and registration. Public safety issues are interesting. It's a little bit more than a year ago that a drone landed in the south lawn of the White House. For a city that seems to be in a state of constant lockdown, the idea that someone could put a drone on the White House campus so casually was one of immediate concern. I understood recently that with the President traveling to London this week, the civil aviation authorities have simply announced that there will be no drone activity anywhere in London during this week. And that may be in part because at the beginning of this week, Monday of this week in fact, the first reported strike of a commercial aircraft by a drone occurred within 6 miles of Heathrow. In fact, pilots are reporting an increasing number of near misses with drones in the national airspace. Over a 6-month period, beginning of this year, the end of last, pilots were reporting near misses at a level greater than 3.5 times per day. This was a significant increase in 2014 when the FAA began to record that number. It was less than 1 time a day on average. Even in the public safety applications, the use of drones have raised some concerns. When California had wildfires last year, journalists thought it might be helpful to get some aerial surveillance of a very real public safety risk. The first responders, those who were going up in the air in helicopters, immediately became concerned about their own safety and refused to operate the helicopters intended to fight the fires until there was agreement from the journalists that the drones would not be operating in the airspace. Apart from the public safety dimension, privacy issues are also very real. Drones, by their design, have the ability to do a form of pervasive and surreptitious surveillance that we've never before experienced. You can imagine, for example, seeing a person standing outside your home and taking your photograph and wondering why is that person doing that. Perhaps if you've seen some of the images that have come off of Google Street View, you might be a little bit surprised to see how easy it is to capture and make public a person's image, even in a public space where there may be some expectation of privacy. But what you're probably not aware of is the ability of a drone on an ongoing basis to capture the images and do identification of hundreds or perhaps thousands of people at a political rally. And by the way, that activity might be very well justified to protect public safety, to identify individuals who may indeed pose a risk to a large public gathering. But you have simultaneously introduced a new technology that makes possible the rapid identification of people who gather in public places for a political purpose. Third issue, which came up rather quickly just before Christmas time this past year, is the registration of drones. What happens precisely when a drone causes an accident? When a person sees a drone operating on their private property, how is the person to know who the operator of the drone is? And so the FAA, out of concern that drones were going to be widely deployed after purchases on Christmas or leading up to Christmas, put in place a hastily crafted plan for drone registration, basically saying to the manufacturers it was sufficient if there were a serial number inside the battery compartment of the drone, so in the instance that the drone caused an accident and you could physically identify it, lift it up, you would have a registration number and presumably some way to identify the operator. In the United States, central to the regulation of drones is the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, which has as its core competence the regulation of the national airspace and the protection of public safety. The FAA was told by the U.S. Congress in 2012 to accelerate the deployment of drones, to enable the more widespread use, while simultaneously developing a comprehensive plan to address public safety and related concerns. The FAA has still not finalized its regulation and has not yet addressed the privacy issues that many organizations have raised. Yet it has simultaneously, pursuant to its 2012 authority, granted numerous waivers to drone operators, allowing them to operate drones under 200 feet in any part of the commercial airspace that's not otherwise restricted. Those waivers have typically gone to large companies, and they've been granted at an increasing pace. In September last year, about 3 years after passage of the Act, 1,700 of these waivers have been granted. I looked this morning, less than a year later, now about 5,000 waivers have been granted. So these are now drones operating in the United States, no longer subject to the public safety regulatory authority that the FAA had prior to 2012 to regulate those kind of craft. Let me say a few words about EPIC's litigation strategy now that I've described for you the technology and several of the public policy implications. We began looking at the capabilities of drone surveillance almost 10 years ago, because it was actually not long after 9/11 that the Department of Homeland Security and other federal agencies became very interested in a process that we might call automating surveillance. This includes surveillance at the borders, it includes surveillance within cities, it includes surveillance of parts of the country, major sporting events and major political events where the Department of Homeland Security and others have concerns about public safety and enforcement of law. Through a series of Freedom of Information Act requests, we came to learn quite a lot about drones, the tremendous surveillance capabilities they have, their diminishing cost, their expanding range, the ability to keep drones aloft for longer and longer periods of time, and the surprising lack of oversight for their use by the federal agencies. We even had one Freedom of Information Act case concerning the giant blimp that was tethered a few miles north of Washington, D.C. It was a part of an armament system that had been developed in Baghdad. The two blimps operating together, one conducted surveillance, the other had weaponry that could be directed toward targets. and the introduction of J-LIMS just outside of Washington, D.C. was to begin to see if it were possible to move from the battlefield in Iraq to the nation's capital a similar capability. That project, as you may know, didn't turn out so well because the tether broke. The blimp went drifting off and ended up in a forest in Pennsylvania. Fled Zeppelin, he said. Freedom of Information Act and transparency was our first strategy. Our second strategy was a petition to the agency. We had 24 organizations, EPIC, ACLU, and a whole host of others, 50 experts, many members of the public, and we said to the agency 10 days after President Obama signed that act into law, facilitating the deployment of drones in the United States, that it should establish a privacy rule. At least make clear to those who are operating drones within the U.S. that they have an obligation, to some extent, to limit the amount of surveillance. The agency sat on our petition for 2.5 years. In November of 2014, they responded by saying that they were going to consider the privacy issues in a rulemaking. We all were very excited, had lots and lots of proposals. And then in February of 2015, announced the rulemaking and said that privacy was outside the scope of the regulation, at which point we sued them. Wonderful Washington tradition. EPIC versus FAA, you'll find the case online. I argued in the DC circuit earlier this year, and our claim was very simple. We simply said that the agency, having committed to undertake a rule on privacy, its failure to do so was a violation of law, and the court should order the agency to do what it already said it would do. So we're now waiting for a decision. We'll see what happens. Third part of our litigation strategy concerns the registration issue. As I mentioned a moment ago, it's actually quite important to be able to readily identify autonomous devices that operate in the physical space adjacent to you. The registration scheme proposed by the FAA seemed the most minimal thing you could imagine. If you're a commercial airline pilot or if you're a ship captain, you know that when you interact with another plane or another vessel, you get to recognize the identity of the craft. And by the way, the same thing is true driving a car. You may not know who the driver is, but you do see a license plate on the car. Yes, we experience this every single day in our lives. When a car goes by, there is accountability for that vehicle operating in the public space to protect public safety. Drones apparently don't carry that obligation. According to the FAA, they could fly within 10 feet of you, perfectly permissible, and you would have no idea who the operator of that craft is. So we urged the FAA, in their consideration of the registration issue, to require drone manufacturers to actually broadcast, make easily accessible, open your iPhone, open the app that says, drone identity, and know right next to you, easily and at no cost, who's operating that mechanical device. FAA decided not to do that. We thought that was interesting. Then we learned that it was a secretive meeting of only industry groups, off the books literally. They didn't follow the government and the sunshine rules, and we sued them over that. That was our fourth part of our litigation strategy. So we've got lots and lots of interesting cases going. We're trying to establish accountability for the use of drones in the United States. Now, the last part of my talk, and I will be brief, is to engage this question of the invasive other. And I've been thinking a lot about this. There's a tendency in the privacy world to say, well, that kind of surveillance looks like a variation of that kind of surveillance, which is a variation of that kind of surveillance. But I've actually come to the view on this topic that something very different is happening, because we are beginning to deal with devices, as I suggested earlier, that are semi-autonomous. And we're going to see more of this. We're going to see robots policing, public streets, for example, in addition to drones flying overhead. And how do we talk about this? How do we think about this? Here are a couple of thoughts. Today, right now, between man and machine, we have an accountability asymmetry. It is very easy for a drone to recognize you, identify you, analyze you, determine if you have outstanding warrants, and have consequences for you. It is virtually impossible for you to hold that device to any account. And I think we need to change this radically. I think we need to put in place much clearer rules that establish our control over these devices that are entering our physical space. I am also concerned about what might be described as the automation imperative. Because one of the things I have seen over the years in the realm of surveillance is that even well-intended people operating these systems, authorizing these programs, enacting this legislation, believe that they are able to keep these programs at a stable state without an understanding of the underlying dynamic, the diminishing costs, the increasing adaptability. Technology seeks application, it seeks purpose. And I think we're going to see that in this domain as well. We need to confront the very real scenario that we will move drone technology from a semi-autonomous realm, where there's a pilot on the ground operating a vehicle in the air, to an autonomous realm, where the pilot on the ground is replaced by a program or an artificial intelligence that has as its purpose a public safety articulated rationale for surveillance. Now this is my concluding thought. Isaac Asimov very famously proposed the laws of robotics. And I'm going to read for you his laws of robotics. And then I'm going to propose two additions based on the need to challenge the presence of drones in our physical world. This is what Asimov said about robotics. He said, the first law, a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. Second, a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law. Third law, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protections do not conflict with the first or second laws. These are perfectly fine ways to think about constraining the activity of an automated device in physical space. But I think we need to say more. So my additions to Asimov's law of robotics are as follows. A robot must always reveal to a human being its actual identity, a registration requirement on all autonomous devices. And second, a robot must always reveal to a human being the basis of its decision. Algorithmic transparency. When a machine makes a decision, that should be made public. These are the ways in which we hold machines accountable. This is how we create expectations, not upon ourselves, but upon the invasive other.
And last but not least, we have David.
Hello, thanks for having me. Can you hear me all right? Good. I'm talking about the breakdown between public and private. To really do this topic justice, you probably have to give a whole historical summary or exegesis on the history of privacy. But for our purposes, I kind of want to start more recently. And also we could talk about whether you actually think the difference between public and private should be talked about more as a breakdown or as a blurring of barriers or as something that's become rather permeable. I think that's worth thinking about too. My contention is more, I guess, that it's really, whatever barriers might once have existed have really been rubbed away by digital technologies for reasons that I'm going to get into. And for a simple definition of privacy, though, I like to consider it as simply having some control over what people know about you and how you disclose personal information about yourself, having that right to disclose personal information, and having some autonomy and control, especially in social situations. But I'm also increasingly concerned about what I simply call data privacy, which is what machines and software programs, and sometimes the people who use them, know about us. But I think it's also, as some of the other speakers have indicated, especially important because many of these machines are either fully automated or semi-autonomous or really don't have that much oversight and might be making decisions or feeding decision-making processes without really any kind of human intervention or supervision. So I'll start by quoting a report from 1982. This was commissioned by the National Science Foundation. And they commissioned a think tank called the Institute of the Future, which is a spin-off from the RAND institution, RAND Corporation. And they were looking at the prospects for teletext and video text in the United States, which obviously didn't turn out very well, though teletext, I think, had a pretty long life in France and some other places. But it's, you know, sort of an early internet-type technology. And the quote is, "At the same time that these systems will bring a greatly increased flow of information and services into the home, they will also carry a stream of information out of the home about the preferences and behavior of its occupants." So that was about 34 years ago, and I think that's actually spot on. We live in a world of very much centered around personalized services, and certainly the quid pro quo of having those services personalized for us is that we increasingly reveal a great deal about ourselves, our habits, who we are, where we go, pretty much anything you can imagine. We live under a system of practically automated 24/7 and an increasingly granular surveillance. And for a long time, the home itself, which this quote focuses on, was sort of an inviolable space. I mean, not everyone has privacy at home. Children, domestic workers, sometimes women or spouses in difficult relationships, all kinds of people don't really have privacy at home. But it's still generally thought of a general site of privacy. It's a kind of contained space. In the pre-digital world, we got some insight into what happens in people's homes or what people are up to through market research, census records, surveys, loyalty cards, credit bureaus, the work of government agencies. And there was a pretty flourishing industry of data brokers even before the digital era. But obviously we've had some profound and perhaps even revolutionary shifts with the move to digital technologies. The home has been made really transparent in a way that it's never been before. And now that we have these technologies like this old report predicted that are informing on what happens in the home, we also have those technologies with us, right? They become mobile, so that transparency has really been applied to the human level as we take our smartphones with us and increasingly do more and more through our smartphone. That sense that we're always kind of reporting on ourselves is not only coming from the home and what we might be watching on TV or ordering to our homes, it's now also happening on the go and at our jobs and through our smartphones. And the smartphone, I think, is pretty key to all this and to this breakdown in privacy. It's become the universal prosthetic. Practically everyone has one. It's sort of become the Star Trek tricorder. It's this all-purpose tool that can kind of do anything. And even actually, if you're a Star Trek fan, you may have seen in some episodes, they often take the tricorder and they're in some emergency or something like that, and they find some unexpected use for the tricorder. It powers some other device or gets the crew out of some disaster unexpectedly. We've almost seen something similar now, which is that our smartphones keep on acquiring new features, even when the hardware themselves are not being upgraded. There's a kind of feature creep. There are new uses being conceived for the sensors that are already in the phones, and then there are more being added each product cycle. So for example, now we have the various sensors in your smartphone being used for sleep tracking, for step counting, and for other forms of bio-behavioral monitoring, and I'm sure that more are going to follow. And some of these were actually really conceived of not necessarily by the phone manufacturer, whoever put that gyroscope in the phone, but was a possibility that was thought of later by other people who realized that these sensors are actually quite flexible. And so I think that one of the other big factors we have to talk about with the role of the smartphone is also this general state of precarity that many of us live under, depending on whose statistics you believe. Up to a third of the United States may be precariously employed in some way or freelance workers. I'm certainly among them. So at the same time, you have this general state of precarity and also this growth of corporate power. And the phone itself has become this tool, and also the internet, which we access through our phones, that is always promised as something new, perhaps a way out of our current situation. You just have to refresh the feed, and you'll find something new or some new possibility or opportunity, whether it's jobs, news, relationships, Uber rides, photos. Everything is done via the smartphone now, and often via the traditional feed that we're used to on social networking sites. The feed has become sort of the archetypal interface. At the same time, these feeds have been presented to us as unmanageable and always updated and kind of overwhelming, so we have to defer some autonomy or responsibility to the corporations managing our feeds, frequently by allowing them to do some algorithmic sorting, which is, of course, really upset Instagram users now that they've learned that their Instagram feeds are going to be algorithmically sorted pretty soon. And as someone else, I believe, mentioned, the phone certainly cuts us off from one another in public. One interesting thing, though, about the phone, I think, is that it certainly inhibits one kind of sociality, which is the face-to-face, in-person sociality. You don't really feel inclined to go up to someone with a smartphone and initiate a conversation. At the same time, it enables these other forms of sociality, but it's just all happening at a distance and mediated through the phone. You can actually be rather social through your smartphone and discover new social possibilities, but it's not happening in your immediate physical space, most likely. So through the phone and through the fact that we've all been made transparent, and that at the same time we're completely transparent to corporations and governments while they are rather opaque towards us, we find, I think, that digital surveillance and data analytics are actually the perfect neoliberal technologies, because what they really do is, besides compromising this boundary between public and private, is they allow the market to be extended practically anywhere. And by that, I mean, really, is that surveillance is the new business model, or is the preeminent business model for our tech economy. And so what you have to do to grow as a tech company is to find new opportunities for data collection, create new metrics, and also find new actions and behaviors to surveil. So the proliferation of smart devices could really just be seen as the proliferation of surveillance devices, I think. And I really think there's, at least in the current form, the current kind of paradigm and the way things are headed, there's no real way that personal privacy can stand up to this kind of thing, especially when surveillance is just considered kind of the cost of doing business or getting these services, and that you have to submit to it. So a specific example we could cite is there was an interesting recent report in Bloomberg about Facebook. Facebook is worried about the decline in sharing. They claim that we're actually sharing as much as ever, but we're sharing a lot of articles and memes and videos and things like that, but we're not really sharing a lot about ourselves. Facebook cares a lot, of course, about personal sharing and knowing what you're doing. So Facebook actually told a journalist that there was a 20% decline in personal sharing year over year. To me, that was really interesting, not only because it reveals something very near and dear to Facebook, but also this way in which it was presented. Year over year, this 20% decline. It's almost the way that corporate profits or revenues are discussed. And you can see a real, almost one-to-one relationship there, that corporate profits can only grow as long as sharing and surveillance and data collection grow. And actually, in that article, Facebook told the Bloomberg writer that they were worried about something called context collapse, which I thought was very interesting, because for a number of years, a lot of media theorists and people who study this stuff have used that phrase, and I think it's actually a very useful term to kind of assess where we are now. In short, it's basically this notion that we used to have all different social environments, and that our privacy was often determined by context and was very contextually dependent. But the consequence of network digital systems, and especially social networks, is that our privacy is now more networked, and those contexts are less discrete, right? So for example, on Facebook, you're friends possibly with hundreds of people from all different facets of your life, from old boyfriends or girlfriends, to your boss, to close friends or family members. So there's a way in which these traditional social contexts break down or bleed into each other, and it's much harder to guard your privacy when there's this sort of intermingling between social contexts and really intermingling, I think, of data and surveillance systems and various monitoring systems. So Facebook is very late in the game kind of cotton on to this idea that people aren't always comfortable sharing to 500 people at a time who come from all these different contexts in their lives. To which I guess I can only say, I mean, I'm glad they're worried about this, but I wish it had come a long time ago. At the same time, I think we at least have to mention that there's been this massive growth, of course, in government surveillance, mostly unchecked. It definitely predates commercial surveillance, but is also deeply intertwined with it. And as we well know, government surveillance depends a lot on the existing systems of commercial surveillance, not only through cooperation with tech companies, but also subpoenaing tech companies for information, or issuing national security letters, or sometimes outright hacking. Ad tech is sort of a field where the NSA apparently has had a lot of success hacking into various ad networks and piggybacking on cookies that are kind of issued as part of a normal person's web browsing, and use those existing technologies which are supposed to facilitate a supposedly benign commercial surveillance. Well, we found that governments and intelligence agencies are able to appropriate them for their own purposes. So I think some of the general characteristics of this kind of environment that we need to pay attention to are that, one, it's largely automated. It's also very positivist, or encourages a certain kind of positivist thinking. The machine sort of feeds itself. It's dependent on a series of feedback loops. Often there's this idea that, at least through analytics or big data driven processes, that whatever conclusion comes out is right, that that correlation is all we need to know, that causation doesn't even really matter that much, technology is neutral, so we don't necessarily need to question the process. That goes along with, I think, a certain amount of algorithmic secrecy, or at least a lack of transparency about how these algorithms are often judging us. And in some cases, we don't even know, even the people using the algorithms themselves may not actually know. For example, there's the city of Fresno, there's a story about this, I think, in the Washington Post not that long ago, uses a predictive policing tool where threat scores are assigned to various addresses and people in the community, and cops who are sent to respond to a call might be given information about the threat score of the person whose home they're responding to. And there are all kinds of problems with this, not least the fact that the only people who know what criteria go into the threat score are actually the private company that makes the software that determines the threat score. So the cops themselves don't even know what goes into this, much less the person who's, the civilian who's on the other end of that police call, who doesn't know the criteria, of course, but also probably doesn't even know that they have a threat score. So through this system of surveillance really on an extravagant scale, we have a tremendous amount of behavioral monitoring going on. So not only our preferences are being reported about us all the time, but we're really being tracked on a 24/7 basis, and increasingly in a granular way. I mean, all the talk right now is about, it seems like, is about companies trying to track us between different devices and different environments. And it seems we're getting there. I expect we already have, of course, advertising following us around on the internet, but pretty soon we're going to have advertising following us around between our various devices, and perhaps even in the physical world, sort of the Minority Report outcome, if you've ever seen that film, in which different devices in public recognize people either by their faces or by optical scan, and customized advertisements appear in public. That's sort of this presented as this kind of horrible dystopic outcome in Minority Report, but it really seems we're not that far away from that. Well, I think it's important to talk about this breakdown between public and private now, and some of the very deleterious consequences we've already seen in terms of bias, being different forms of racial and gender bias being incorporated into algorithms, a lack of algorithmic transparency. We've also seen things like the Facebook contagion study, or the use of differential pricing. I think there are other terms for it, but where you're charged a certain price on e-commerce sites based on personal information about you. So that started first basically just based on zip codes, but now it's increasingly getting more specific and more customized, where online retailers hope to charge you essentially the maximum they think you would pay in each situation. And all this I find very concerning, but I don't think, and this is perhaps a subject for debate here, I don't know if we've really seen what what coercion has looked like on a mass scale. I don't know if we've really experienced or seen that yet. For example, I wonder, there was this experiment the other day where a Russian, I guess a Russian activist did an experiment where he took pictures of people in public and then used some sort of open source or publicly available facial recognition engine, and was able to identify more than 60% of the people just through their social media profiles. And that was pretty disconcerting, but then you have to ask what's going to happen in a few years when we all have a face print that we can't get rid of or change, barring some drastic measures, and we're all immediately identifiable in public by our faces, by these various automated systems from government on down. So I guess one question is, how do we respond to this situation if these barriers between public and private have really been eroded? What do we do about it? I see a lot of people and scholars, experts in the industry. It's interesting now, a lot of them sort of talk like spies, and I think for a good reason, but we hear talk about attack surfaces or adversaries or threat models or using OPSEC or COMSEC. And I think some of this stuff is very interesting, and certainly we want to promote the use of encryption and tools like that. And it's also important for dissidents, activists, journalists, artists, scholars, and many other people. But most people aren't spies, and I think the response for a lot of us has been sort of to securitize the self. This is kind of the smart, informed consumerist response, I think, which is that you use a Tor or VPN, you look into encryption, you opt out of whatever you can, you get ad blockers, things like that. There's this whole sort of, I mean, one term for it might be cyber hygiene or digital hygiene, but it's kind of, I think, at least among early adopters, almost graduated more towards this kind of spy type mentality where we all have to be rather vigilant and paranoid, even if we don't necessarily have good reason to be. And there's almost, I think, a certain kind of machismo in it. And I think the obvious problem is that this isn't really tenable for most people. Most people don't either have the knowledge or the time or ability to kind of keep up with this stuff. But even so, even if you're perhaps one of the people in this room who is interested in these kinds of techniques and tactics and self-protection, even so, it still leads to endless cycles of maintenance, updates, charging, tending to your gadgets, securing them, researching them. I mean, recently, for example, I started using a program, LastPass, a password manager, to help keep track of all my passwords and try to create more secure passwords. And it's not as if I suddenly need a password manager for my password manager, but there is a way in which you start choosing one of these kind of meta-level tools to help secure and organize your digital life, which is to say really your life, in which they only keep compiling upon one another, or there are always sort of more updates that are needed, or more tools, or more ways in which you can be a savvy, secure user of these technologies. And to me, I think that just ends up being another form of consumerism. It really further entangles us in these very systems that we find so harmful. And I think one of the big problems of the current tech economy is that it's made us all into laborers, producing data and content for big platforms. And I think in some ways securitizing the self may not be more labor, but it certainly is giving into kind of the conditions set by the platform owners. It feels a little bit more reactionary and incrementalist, and not radical in the way that I think we should hope for. Now, I don't claim that I have some kind of solution. At the same time, I think we should encourage very practical measures from government regulation to lawsuits that seek to improve things for the larger public. At the same time, I think as part of kind of this more radical thinking or trying to think outside the current paradigm of simply adapting ourselves to these current conditions, we might also begin to realize that a militant rejection of certain technologies, even a kind of Ludditism, makes a certain kind of sense, but only, I think, if it's foregrounded in this kind of reasoning. You aren't necessarily rejecting technology, but you're rejecting surveillance capitalism, or the surveillance capitalism that's enabled and propagated by these technologies, or simply the really crappy politics of so many of the tech companies behind these technologies and services. Or you might also just be saying, I reject the consumerism and the labor that really goes into being a secure Facebook or internet user. Still, I do come back finally to this idea of what I call entanglement, which is just simply that we're all kind of implicated in this stuff. Our choices are few. Many of us can't opt out, or opting out is too much work. And really, we shouldn't have to. It shouldn't necessarily be our responsibility to come up with or just to secure more just ways of operating in this kind of society and economy. Still, I think we should hope for or work for some kind of radical reinvention of how this stuff works, whether it's social networks without metrics, communications without surveillance, or business models that don't depend on personal data. I think that's unlikely to change anytime soon, but in my mind, if we want to restore some measure of privacy, or at least restore it as a cultural and social value, that's really the only way forward. So thank you very much.
Thanks to all three papers, all fascinating and all very different but intersecting in suggestive ways, I'm sure, in all your minds in different ways. So I've been asked to get the conversation rolling, so get your questions ready. But I might start with, well, let's see, I might start with throwing out a question that came to me from each of the three, and rather than just address them one by one, because we want them to finish together, you can just organically choose which one you'd like to address and ignore the other two, or it may come up as we go. Actually, Jacob, just at the end there, you made me think of, and the drone stuff as well, the Google Glass phenomenon, which seems to have disappeared for a while, but just like cell phones have several waves and attempts to come in, I'm sure we haven't seen the last of even Google Glass. And the fact that some of these so-called explorers would get beaten up in fast food venues and things, then they attests to the kind of sense that this isn't a type of invasion we're not ready for yet. The fully cyborg individual, that might be incremental as well. So, for Inez, the right to be forgotten precedent, I think of the Streisand effect. Are you familiar with the Streisand effect? Which, does everybody know what that is? Apparently Barbara Streisand wanted her, am I saying it wrong?
No, I just did.
Oh, okay. Yes, she was trying to get her home expunged from, I think it was Google Earth, so that there weren't any photos of it. And when the public got wind of this, they would just post hundreds and thousands of pictures of her home from various angles. And so that's since become a kind of instance where anytime you try and vary information or try to be forgotten, it will rebound and then you get worse. And the most recent example of that was UC Davis, the pepper spray cop. It came out that the University of California system paid $100,000 to expunge pepper spray cop from the internet's memory. And in the last week, I don't know about your feeds, but I've had that officer has jumped back into my feed lately in an example of the Streisand effect. So I'd be interested for us to talk a little more, because I know Mark would like to debate the right to be forgotten mandate premise example, and how that might work in this Westphalian internet. So that's one of the things I think we can zoom in on. Another is, we tend to think of ideas as vaporous things that we can't quite grasp or that are invisible, a bit like germs or bacteria. But I'm wondering about the drone itself as an idea, as a materialized idea which came to pass in the form of the drone. The drones don't just fall out of the sky, somebody has to have the idea of building a drone. And you sort of imply that with the notion of the technological imperative. So I'm interested in the idea of these technologies themselves as being invasive ideas, as kind of crystallized ideology. And that maybe links to the third question for Jacob, is that something like, one example is a drone, but another might be the Fitbit that measures your steps. I found out recently that a lot of corporations are using the Fitbit as part of their wellness program. And so that is an idea. So, right, saying we want to have our employees be surveilled at the level of their, heart rates and blood pressure and things like that. So we tend to think of invasive ideas as these foreign ideas of terroristic ideas of such, communism, whatever. But what about neoliberalism as a kind of idea that is an enemy within, one that we don't think of as invasive because we live it, we experience it, where we live and breathe it, and yet this idea came from somewhere. I don't think it came from precarious workers. So neoliberalism is an invasive idea and its various technological instantiations. So maybe we should start with the discussion about the right to be forgotten. I don't know, Mark, you had thoughts?
Okay, I'll jump in. Let me just begin my remarks by saying one of the great challenges working in the privacy field as a civil liberties advocate and human rights advocate is always to find solutions that protect freedom of speech and government transparency. There's a common sense intuition, which I think is not correct, that whenever we're talking about privacy, we're balancing privacy against freedom of speech, or we're balancing privacy against government transparency. I think this fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the right. Oftentimes, when people say privacy, what they're really talking about is government secrecy or corporate secrecy. And the claim there is not one of personal privacy as a fundamental right, and clearly a freedom of expression claim or a government transparency claim should prevail. I give this background because the topic which Agnes raised has been particularly difficult in this space about right to be forgotten. I've given talks on this around the world. I feel quite strongly, and I'm going to say something truly radical. I don't know if that's possible here, but I'm just going to put it out there and see what happens. The right to be forgotten decision is so profoundly misunderstood in the United States. Not only is it good for freedom of expression, it's good for the future architecture of the internet and the hope for the widespread dissemination of information from multiple providers. I believe both of these statements deeply. I believe it is not against freedom of expression, and I believe it is a good thing to hold a search engine like Google accountable, liable for the consequences of privacy invading acts, precisely so that those providers of information on the internet, the actual news organizations, are protected. Now let me just say a few words about the case. I don't want this to take up forever, but I would love to continue the discussion with others who are interested. This case is about a private Spanish citizen whose personal bankruptcy, which he had, by the way, satisfied, and which had occurred in the 1990s, had been suddenly made available 10 years later through the emergence of internet search, and most specifically through Google. People came to him and they said, whenever I type your name in, I see this news article from 10 years ago about how you lost your home or whatever happened. He said, well, that's really unfair to me. I mean, it's not who I am, right? And by the way, I satisfied the debt. He goes to the newspaper and he goes to Google and he says, please take this article down, please take the links down. It's unfair to me, right? The Spanish Data Protection Agency says the news organization is a news organization and we're not going to tell them what they should publish. But Google, which is a commercial search provider, which obtains commercial value from the publication of others' information, can, in some circumstances, be held to account. And we think this is one of those circumstances. Not all circumstances, but this is private information about a private individual. Google gets very upset about this decision. The case, by the way, is not called the Right to Be Forgotten case. It's called Google versus Spain. Google sues the Spanish government for trying to enforce its privacy law. And the decision goes to the Court of Justice of the European Union, the High Court of Europe, which looks very closely at this and in a very reasoned decision reaches the same conclusion. And by the way, this is very important to know about the decision. It says on the one hand, we have the privacy interest of the individual, and on the other hand, we have the right of the public to access information about an individual. Not a freedom of expression issue, not a censorship issue. This is not China shutting down speech on the internet. This is about whether or not you get access to information about individuals. And so the High Court says, in this instance, it may be appropriate for Google to remove the link. The story doesn't go away. There's no Orwellian memory hole here. In fact, if you want to get the story, think about this. If you're a publisher, where do you get it? You don't go to the company that dominates 90% of search in Europe. You go to the actual publisher that's online providing news to the public, which is my second point. So how we understand that case turns out to be enormously important. Now I'm going to get really, I had two radical points. I'm going to make my last radical point. And I made this argument, by the way, I've written about this in a lot of places. But I did this in USA Today. I said, I read that opinion, and what struck me was not that the origins were from Spain or from Luxembourg. The origin to me was the Brandeis article on the right to privacy. Because when the American people's lawyer, future Supreme Court Justice, argued for the right to privacy in 1890, the very first exception he said was in some circumstances, the public will have the right to know about true private facts of individuals. And in those cases, that privacy right will have to give way to the public's right. And I agree with that, by the way. If this Spanish citizen was being considered to be Minister of Justice in Spain, and he had a bankruptcy 10 years ago, it's relevant, and we should know it. But he wasn't, and it isn't. And the decision there was correct. It is pro-First Amendment. It is pro a robust internet architecture, and it's very much a part of the American legal tradition.
Do you want to respond to that?
No.
Or do you want to bring it somewhere else?
I don't disagree. I don't disagree with it. The decision, I mean, I don't know how much you know about it, but both Mark and I probably have had similar experiences. This is the most heated, painful, conflict-ridden issue at the moment within our community. I organized a discussion about it 2 weeks ago, and I thought we were all going to kill each other. So,
I brought it up to begin the
so this, you know, it's a source of intense debate. What is misunderstood around the decisions is from the way it's being framed in the United States. It's being framed basically as European disliking Google and trying to attack and undermine a US corporation. And they've tried to do that using many tools, antitrust being one of them. But the right to be forgotten is one of the two that is being used right now to try to go after a very effective US corporations. What is not very well understood in the current framing of the right to be forgotten is that it has very ancient roots by the context of the digital world. The right to be forgotten is not a creation of the last 2 years. It has been around for decades. It is present in political theory. It is also a movement, a civil society-driven movement at grassroots level, in Europe in particular, from mothers and fathers of kids. It's very based around the child and the fact that children now, as we have been hearing, are putting things out in the public world that they may regret very deeply when they enter the workforce. So there are many sources to the demand for the right to be forgotten, including at grassroots level, and these are not understood. Second, it is not a European issue, as my slide was demonstrating. It's remarkable that a decision such as that one, within 2 years, got quoted in almost 20, 30 different decisions around the world. I don't think there is any other cases. And what it shows is how much that decision is reflecting people's anguish over internet. And the court is reflecting that anguish to me. So it's not just going after Google and after a corporation, it's also reflecting something very deep within people that they actually would like eventually to be forgotten, provided it, you know. Thirdly, what I find interesting, if we go back to the topic, and I think there are sufficient garde-fous to protect freedom of expression, but it's, you know, it's, of course, there are some tension there. What is interesting with the case is, right now, is what I was pointing out, is the fact that it is, Google is in many ways an idea, a US idea. This you can hear around the world. We love it, you know, speaking as a non-American, but we also recognize that through Google, it's US culture that comes to us. So it is, you know, it's an idea. The terms of services reflect US culture, US norms. They do not reflect global norms or European norms. So what you add through Google is an invasion of some kind, but benevolent to a large extent, although after everything I've heard, I'm starting to wonder, but never mind. It is still overall a fantastic, incredible tool, which I love myself. But it is an invasion of some kind. It is, you know, it's a US business model, and it's US norms that are being driven into the world through the terms and services. What's happening right now is very much a very Westphalian kind of conflict, with a number of countries, beginning with France and the European Union, saying, well, actually we're going to fight back, and not only are we going to try to control the way Google functions, that is the way the concept, the social norm, and the business model function, we're also going to fight back by forcing our own norms. And that's what is interesting with the current phase of the right to be forgotten. It is that the French regulator has said, we want that decision to be enforced globally. And that becomes an extraterritorial force that is being imposed on the French decision. The right to be de-indexed is not just limited to google.fr. It is to be implemented to google.com. And by so doing, France is, you know, almost as you know, it's like a reaction in physics, is reacting back at Google and saying, now it's our own norm that we want to impose extraterritorially. And you do see a lot of it currently in the world of internet around data location, data protection. There is a lot of actually very Westphalian conflict being played out in the digital world. So while it is different, of course the digital world is different from the material world, there are old conflicts that are being played out in that way.
So let's open this up to, unless Jacob had a postscript on this. Sorry.
Oh, it's all right, Jeff. Yeah, we can Not on the right to be forgotten.
Yeah, I think we want to open this up a little more to see what other people are, where they're putting the connections. So please.
Thank you. Is this on? My question is really simple and relatively primitive. As a social scientist, many of us know people who've gone to jail for not providing information in criminal cases in order to protect the people that they have sworn that allegiance to protect in the interest of maintaining their anonymity. So my question is really, well, there are a couple, but I'll try to wrap them into one, which is, how is it that Google can both...
You have to talk into the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is that okay? How is it that Google can both withhold information, say, from government or court in the interest of protecting my privacy, and at the same time tell me that they're not going to tell me the criteria around which they decide whether or not I can or cannot be erased?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure. Google tells you what information about
Well,
your
for
database.
example, when Google says to the government that they're not going to hand over certain information based upon their requirement to protect the privacy of the people that they have information on the one hand, and on the other, tell the people, as it were, that they're protecting that they do not have the right to know the grounds upon which they actually will or will not erase them. That is to say, they don't have algorithmic transparency.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I think I understand what you're asking, although oddly, I would almost flip around the premises. So in fact, Google routinely discloses information about you to the federal government, does not disclose that fact to you, which, by the way, we've made this argument with regard to all internet companies. I know we're kind of picking on Google today, though frankly I think they've earned it. But it is a general proposition that when anyone in possession of your information turns it over to the government, we think you should have.
You have to know,
You should have that right, and that's one of the debates right now about some of the NSA post-Snowden FISA reforms. But I think so on the first point, I actually don't think you do know. Now, on the second point, which is a criticism that some journalists have raised about the right to be forgotten implementation, they said, why is it that Google gets to make this decision as opposed to the court, which I think is the point that you're making. So a couple of thoughts on this. First of all, I see this simply as compliance. Google is subject to law. There's a decision that says people have a right to go to the company and have the links removed. Google's expected to comply. If the individual's not satisfied with the outcome, they still have a legal redress. So you might go to the company and say, please remove the link, and they go into their black room and come back and say, no, we've decided not to. You still have a legal basis, as the court in Luxembourg said, to go to a data protection authority in Europe and say, I think they should, and someone will make a decision. But here's the key point on that issue, where I think there's also been quite a bit of confusion. I think if there's a private matter that you have the right to have removed, you would like to have it resolved between you and the company without opening it up, to journalists and third parties to say, well, you removed that, search record, but you didn't remove that search record, because of course now you've created an enormous disincentive for people to exercise their rights, and we're very familiar with that from other areas of social science. So I think these are actually very important questions to be asking and thinking about. I do think the discussion in the U.S. has been skewed in many ways. I mean, I agree with a lot of what Anya said. Certainly one of the most fascinating points, which we could come back to, is the dissemination of legal decisions because of our increasingly interconnected world. This is something that Justice Breyer has been writing about quite a bit, and it's really quite important in terms of the internet. So on that point I agree, but I actually don't agree with the point that this has been cast as an effort to go after Google. It's been cast in the U.S. as European data protection law colliding with U.S. free expression law. I think that's the way it's largely been presented, and I don't think that's an accurate framing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for a fantastic panel and great papers. I just was going to try to bring it back a little bit to the larger context of the conference about invasive others on different levels. So I'm wondering how what we consider invasive ideas or technologies help to determine what other kinds of things we consider invasive. So for instance, there are drones at the border, right? So drones then become part of us while things at the border, crossing the border, become invasive. There are face print technology, other kinds of biometrics, as you were talking about, that are used to control and regulate migrants and refugees in ways that are, one might call it, public safety, but I mean, it constitutes them as an invasive other. And similarly, these technologies are used often to surveil pandemics or epidemics. You think of the technologies used in Ebola and where to locate them and so on. So I just want to see what you guys how you would think about these invasives in relation to one another, how one constitutes the other, how when something becomes more part of us, then something else becomes more invasive and so on. So to put these different things, even though they're different entities and they might be operating at different scales, but put them in dialogue to think about how they determine one another.
Jump in.
Sure. Well, it's a good question and a broad one in some ways. I mean, I think one way of looking at things is that so many of these processes we're talking about depend on a certain type of informed consent, and I think that's very lacking, whether we're talking about just people understanding the terms of service agreements that they agree to all the time, or just the various types of monitoring to which people are subjected. There's a real lack of consent and education and awareness. But I think one idea that you kind of point to is that certainly for some people, certain processes or ideas or ways of being tracked are not invasive, or opinions can vary among well-meaning people. And a lot of this stuff can be sort of a matter of personal preference. This is perhaps not as consequential an example, but does show, I think, how certain people think and how certain people approach these environments as more real, perhaps, than others, and I'll be more specific, which is that sometimes on Twitter you see people, especially people who are in some sort of intense debate or argument, then someone else chimes in and someone might say, like, get out of my mentions. That's sort of a common thing. There's this way in which people see someone kind of, even though it's a public space, ostensibly sort of a public forum, and the conversation is being had publicly, sometimes when certain people jump in who are considered unwelcome in one way or another, or just simply their attitude or the way they enter the conversation, people say, get out of my mentions, basically stop talking to me, you're blocked, whatever. Now, that may or may not be a kind of a reasonable reaction depending on the situation, but I think it also shows that even when we have certain ideas about publicness or about making ourselves available to being watched and acting out certain behaviors in public, we might not always be comfortable with having others involved, whether it's responding to our conversation or or collecting data about us. And so there's a way in which various conceptions, I think, of consent and privacy actually operate more on a spectrum or a continuum, rather than saying, a conversation on Twitter perhaps it is totally public or private. We may have to think more in terms of kind of gradations of what might be allowed depending on different types of values and circumstances. I don't know if that answers it.
If I may add a few things. I think that the technology, the information technology is a tool to define what is the other and who is the invader, as much as it is a tool to define who is us. That's what is remarkable about that. And that's the first thing. The second, as I mentioned maybe quickly earlier, is that it's a technology that allows us to redefine community beyond borders. But yet they are very strong communities with big walls, and the way we protect our community online is quite like a vigilante of some kind. We don't want these people to be following us, and we don't want to listen to them on Twitter. And so we create real virtual walls around our community. It's the echo chamber, which is one of the issue with one of the potential drawback of that fantastic technology. So that to me is what, you know, that's what is making that technology so important. And with the example that we had heard as well around biometrics or the drones, it is about identifying who is the invader. You know, it's and ultimately that's, and the invader from within. That's very clear, but that's not new. I think any invaders at some point becomes is defined as from without, but there are many of them that from within. Historically, when you look back at which ideas, which people have been pushed back, killed, censored, imprisoned, they are not all coming from outside. Many of them were from within. Yesterday, in the first session, there was a very interesting, one of the slide was a slide from, I think it was an Italian cartoon, an awful Italian cartoon against, I don't know if it was Italian, by the way, don't quote me on that. But anyway, it was a cartoon against the migrants, and you had migrants, all the migrants coming in Europe at the moment, and there were some rats. So there were migrants and rats. And the rats were supposed to represent the terrorists and to distinguish them from the real migrants, which presumably maybe the better migrants, the good other that we are ready to. It was a bit, it's not clear, but to me that cartoon, which I didn't know, was so revealing of how we represent the others. And the rat as possibly a terrorist, I don't know, reminded me then of the otherness that is very prevalent in our society as a response to terrorism, and it is the, how do you say it in English? People are being, citizens are, the citizenship of individuals that are deemed not to belong is being removed. So that France had proposed
Denaturalization.
Yeah, how do you call it? Denaturalizing. So it's very prevalent right now in the Gulf countries and in the Middle East, where basically individuals that are deemed to be not from within, even though they've been there for generation and generation and generation, from one day to the next, have their citizenship removed and are physically put on a plane to go to a country where it is said that they will belong better. So, for instance, that touch, you know, Shia minorities in the Sunni-dominated countries, if they happen to be political opponents, from the day to the next, could find themselves sent back to Lebanon, for instance. In Europe, there is a possibility of people losing their citizenship if they were deemed to have committed an act which was so much outside the norms of that home that they could no longer be part of it. So the law was proposed in France. It was a constitutional reform, and that eventually it was not rejected. Eventually the government decided not to proceed after much internal complaints, and at least for once the French people reacted to it. But it is in the book of other countries. So there was a Danish man who lost his Danish citizenship early this year, I think, or late last year. And that's a very, I think it's a reflection of our time at the moment, that the use of that citizenship.
Just to make two brief comments coming back to your question. When Ariane approached me about the conference, and I saw the conference theme, the invasive other, I had this first thought, which is, of course, in the context of a sort of a liberal philosophy, We try to be open to the other. We try to be open to people. We try to be open to ideas. And so the phrase, the invasive other, seems almost in that setting purposely provocative, as if we would push back and say, well, people who describe the other as invasive are in a sense closed-minded and anti-immigrant and all. And I understood that. I said, well, I can imagine some way we can carry that debate over to the internet and it would play out as it has elsewhere. But then I thought about it some more, and it really was interesting for me to imagine, well, what would be the invasive other that kind of falls outside of that liberal philosophical tradition? And it became, in effect, the rise of the machine, right? That we do not give that kind of regard and respect to our devices, and yet they seem to be obtaining this type of authority and autonomy. So that actually gave me the insight to give the presentation to you that I have today about drones. But let me say a few more words on the theme, because I can actually talk more about it. We've done a number of privacy cases over the years about what strikes me as the crossover moment when the internet was no longer the electronic online library that we're all so happy about and comfortable with because we get free information any moment, but the internet kind of left the wire and began to enter our homes. So, for example, there's a thermostat company called Nest, which by the way was acquired by Google, that captures a great deal of information about what happens inside of your home. It's not just the heat sensor, by the way. There's also audio. There's an audio sensor inside the Nest thermostat. There are always on devices in your home, right? What's Amazon's device called? Echo, right? Samsung TV, Apple Siri. We did a complaint to the U.S. Federal Trade Commission in which we said, in effect, these physical devices in the home connected to the internet are engaging in a form of surveillance of private spaces. And, you know, I appreciated your remarks. I would still consider my living room a private space, and if I'm talking with my family or, you know, watching TV, I don't think that needs to be broadcast out online and stored on a remote server operated by some large internet firm. But that's actually what's happening. So I think there's an enormous area of space to explore about how the internet, which we have almost, I would say, romanticized in terms of its presence in our this moment in time, is increasingly reaching into our physical world. And it is not just the drones, it is in many other places. In fact, it's most likely in your pocket.
And the bordering.
Machines, your remarks about the identity of these drones, they seem to be Agamben's forgot
the right to be identityless, and ironically, in the biopolitical age, having a non-fixed identity means greater agency.
Greater freedom.
Yes, in certain contexts. So I think that's
Thank you so much for your talk. Thank you so much for your talk. And I'm so glad you just, it's kind of a segue into what I wanted to offer here. I just want to infuse this conversation a little bit with some thought from critical disability studies, because I think there's a bit that it can offer to the kind of non-identity conversation. Earlier, Jacob, you mentioned that you're not going to go into the history a little bit of the differences between public and private, but many feminist disability theorists bring forth the idea that privacy is a kind of socially constructed class idea that is really at the heart of the kind of production of the Enlightenment individual, right, and the kind of individualizing nature of neoliberal capitalism. So what I want to offer is to challenge this notion of privacy in the first place, because I think perhaps, and I could be wrong, but I don't think it's necessary for, well, it might not be necessary at all, that's another question, but I don't think it's necessary for invasion. Sorry, give me a second here. So we talked about Fitbit, for example. It is my understanding that a lot of companies have encouraged their workers to use these technologies to monitor behavioral modes of navigating space. And how much do you sleep, how much do you eat, how many calories, things like this. In order to, it's not just to keep their workers healthy, but it's to cut down on costs for health insurance, for long-term insurance, things like this. And a lot of the times, health insurance companies are encouraging this by employers and CEOs. Just like right now, with a lot of Medicaid changes that happened in the United States with the ACA, a lot of states are adopting a payment model where companies are getting paid bonuses to keep their Medicaid costs down by encouraging people to responsibly monitor themselves and kind of manage disability. So what I want to offer here is that privacy put back into context, in that historical context, because we did exist before the Enlightenment, this kind of self-contained individual notion kind of came about. And ask, what is it about privacy that that we need? What is it? Is it the right to be? Is it dignity? Is it the right to association? Is it social value? I want to just suggest that neoliberalist thought is the invasive other, and how can we fight that? Because I think to unsecuritize the self, I don't think it's to give up agency. So I just play with that.
I'll just say a couple of words. I really appreciated your comments. I had the honor with the most recent case book on privacy law to work with Anita Allen. And Anita's a very distinguished scholar of feminist legal theory. And we would read the same cases and the same materials and come to almost the opposite conclusions. I mean, Brandeis was my big hero and articulated the right to privacy. And her article was about, Brandeis as the Boston patrician propagating, male hierarchy, yes? So I'm very much aware, or at least I try to be aware of the perspective, and in working on this most recent project really tried to take this into account. But I still think the argument that I've made today works in a way, because what I'm trying to say is, however we draw a distinction among people and our ability to incorporate difference and who we are, who we seek to be, this entire realm needs to be understood as operating apart from the devices and machines that we're creating. And I have a genuine concern that we are failing in that mission at the moment in which a rapid change is taking place. So I don't have a great insight into the answer here, but I feel, whether it's post-Enlightenment or pre-Enlightenment, we're still part of this group. But there's something happening at the beginning of the 21st century which is genuinely new. And I think the point that Dominic made when he talked about drones and agency, the other concept here, of course, is freedom. I mean, is the sense of being able to pursue whatever you wish to pursue. And we are giving the freedom to the machines, and they are taking it from us.
Should I go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay. that's a great question, and you raised some very good points. One thing I would say is, I agree with this notion that yeah, privacy can be looked at different ways. I mean, the Brandeis example is useful also because, as you indicated, you know, some people perhaps even at the time or now reinterpret the original Brandeis argument as well. He was more trying to protect his fellow, his people in his social milieu of high-class folks from kind of gossipy reporting on their goings on. So I think it's definitely worth kind of interrogating what we really mean when we say privacy, and also realizing that it's not this monolithic thing. And so that's why I think we should put more stock in these ideas of, well, what does privacy facilitate? And to me, it's really important for things like identity formation or just having some interiority or privacy of thought, but also autonomy and control. And autonomy is a kind of freedom and control over, you know, who you are in the world and how you conduct yourself. And the kind of privacy issues I'm concerned about, I think, are often about ways in which people have that autonomy or control taken away from them in favor of opaque, often automated systems. Also systems that often create a certain standard of privacy or of desirable behavior and then kind of make it algorithmically determined, where if you deviate from sort of the norm or the pattern that's programmed into the system, then you're immediately deemed undesirable or perhaps an invasive other. I have one other note in my notes here, I think. And I also think that increasingly we see that privacy is also kind of dependent on who's really sort of controlling this kind of data. So one reason why I talk about the home is now the home has definitely been made more transparent, but there are all kinds of varying and overlapping privacy dynamics that happen within the home and between the people who live there. And now also you increasingly see that whoever is kind of in charge of the devices in the home, whether it's the person who lives there who's the primary breadwinner and installs the Nest and the cameras and everything else, or whether it's the company to which this stuff is outsourced, actually has a lot of control over the home as this place of data production and the kind of the privacy and autonomy that's granted to the people within the home. So that's why I think that I suppose that, actually maybe I should stop there, but I think this notion is that we can't just say we want to preserve privacy just because we want people to be able to have total control of themselves, and because then you risk kind of giving over too much power to the existing authority figures that we have, whether it's corporate or governmental or simply kind of some patriarchal authority. And so that's why we definitely have to be willing to interrogate matters of difference and also say that there is no monolithic definition of privacy, and also why I think context collapse is useful, because we see that privacy is so contextually dependent. And it doesn't while it has to be historically informed, it doesn't necessarily need to be, you know, we can say that 21st century privacy is going to be something a lot different. It doesn't have to abide by certain Enlightenment norms or that history. But we do need to ask those questions, I think, about do we need to just totally reinvent it for you know, current standards and values today?
Just maybe somebody that you could consider. I don't know how gender sensitive he is in his thinking. I just came across an article he wrote very recently, Joe Kanatachi. He has been appointed UN Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy a couple of months ago. He's a professor in the Netherlands and in Malta. And he is trying to push for the concept of the right to personality. And that is, so I can forward you the article he has written on the concept. It's reflective of thinking in Europe in particular. So the right to personality is very central to the way European political theorists, probably not very gender sensitive or disability sensitive, that I can't say, have thought about. But that could be a way of responding to your question, which is what is it about privacy that we need to keep and that we need to fight for, which is basically the question he's asking. And that's why he ended up with this focus on personality so that's the first thing. And the second thing, because I think gender has been very absent from our discussion, technology has not been very sensitive to the specificities of women in the public space, in the digital public space. So there has been a number of ongoing discussion right now around, for instance, the porn revenge website. That's one example of how technology has turned against women, not just women, but in particular, 98% of the victims are women. Online harassment, again, it is not gender specific in its form, but it is gender specific in the enormous amount of victims that are women. So women who are being targeted online, because they are women and because often they are feminist, they have made some statements in the public space which have resulted in a number of trolls attacking them. So the technology and the digital space, sometimes when I am in my most negative thinking, I feel, we all fought patriarchy for centuries, and then suddenly it's getting reborn in the freaking digital space, and we have to fight again. It's very interesting that a lot of technology-driven companies are not very gender sensitive at all, and there have been too many instances of the hacker world, the programmers world, being the primary driver of online harassment against women from within their own community, as a matter of fact, who were calling for some kind of gender-sensitive guidelines. So we haven't talked about how, the invasive technology is actually forcing, or has forced the i.e. patriarchy.
Game may be a classic example of women being the invasive, considered the invasive.
Absolutely.
Can I
You can
respond
mention
to
that
that?
in the case, right?
Yeah, I think that these points about gender are very good because we see this also, and this relates a little bit to what I said earlier about certain behaviors or even identity types becoming kind of algorithmically standardized. I mean, you see it in facial recognition technologies that can't identify people of certain races, or I think Asian women have a hard time with some facial recognition systems, or you see similar, and this happens throughout wherever there's kind of biometric monitoring, and one reason is because the people who create these systems are mostly white men, and the data sets that inform them are often similarly kind of monochromatic. So what happens when someone who is trans, for example, goes through one of the backscatter x-ray machines at the airport, suddenly they're kind of otherized and set aside as other because the system isn't programmed to really understand them or read them or tolerate them, which is really, I think, also like two different problems. I mean, because the system itself is kind of problematic because it's airport security run amok, but then you also want these systems to not, to not be able to kind of parse or accept people as they are. So there are almost two different problems there, whether we want, we want our systems to be kind of all-inclusive and able to recognize people and let them have the freedom to be who they are, but we also don't want them kind of serving. Yeah, we don't want it. We don't want some surveillance system to be able to capture, say, a trans person or a minority or a person of color just for the sake of feeding into this other illiberal process or kind of bad policy.
I think there's someone at the back.
Yeah, so I guess the aim of my question is, I'm a student and I'm really interested in the user. I think that this forum in particular is kind of like this preaching to the choir, and I'm really interested in the idea of like the accessibility of privacy and potentially the boundaries that that word even has for education and like knowledge of what that means as applied to everyone. So my question is two parts. The first, perhaps a little bit abstract, but I'm really interested in your answers. And so I'm really personal, I guess, professional privacy, that's our personal, what is personal, especially in the virtual world. And second part of that is how the education of personal can manifest and the potential dangers of making users vulnerable with the knowledge of that education. So if we start making this accessible and telling people this is how you understand yourself personally in the virtual world, and how to protect yourself, once you start telling people how to do that, that becomes an algorithm that can then be penetrated and used in negative ways. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good, we have 4 or 5 minutes left, so maybe we should get all the questions.
Together?
Yeah.
I'll keep it really brief and quick. One of the things, one of the it's a fairly simple-minded and simple question. One of the ways in which I understand invasive is something that transfers across a boundary. You know, you either see it coming from in or you see it coming from out. And one of the wonderful things your panel has done, sort of give us a sense of a pervasive other, right? Something that is everywhere and all over the place. So I guess I'm trying to understand, linking it to the sense of ideas that migrate and the sense of a pervasive kind of machine landscape. How you understand distance and how do you see or can we see or how do you understand a glitch in that system that allows us to be aware that something is coming across distance?
Maybe 2 more questions and then
Thank you. I have just some 2 observations. The invasive need not be from the outside. From my own perspective, like in my country, Uganda, the citizens became the other when they were opposed to the state. And then the internet was controlled in such a way that you could not access the internet from within. And instead, people went around all the government blockage and then were using Twitter while in Canada and voting in Uganda. So it was a way that they asserted their agency and then they were able to overcome the imposed restrictions by the state, which was acting arbitrarily by introducing new laws just to prevent people from voting. And then my other observation is, I was an invasive other when I was coming to the US just recently. I was subjected to 3 times I was controlled in Germany, and then I was again controlled by the airlines, which requests for extra information in spite of the biometric information I had already given with my passport, and also with the information that you already have in the system, because they're always collecting information. And then the comment on Google is that the right to be forgotten applies strictly, from my experience, to Europeans. You have to be connected in a way to Europe before you can put across your case and request Google to remove your information. So maybe you can comment on that. Thank you.
Whoa. That's a big one. Maybe the panel should. I just want to put a note here. At first I thought, when I raised my hand first, I thought there was no discussion of gender and I wanted to introduce it. But now that you've said the system, suddenly patriarchy all just reproduces itself, just the shock. When we said the personal is political, and the early days of feeling that we must invade the private because that's where the domestic violence was happening, etc. That seemed so progressive, breaking apart, and this is your talk altogether, and the different meanings of privacy, how right, because we wanted to break it open, and the idea of privacy. So I think, and your wonderful question. So most of the things I wanted to say have been said, but I just want to give you a note, which is in the big right, turn to the right in Europe now, one of the big themes is the domus. The right wing is requesting that the home be revalued. Of course, the woman goes back into it, but also that the new idea, which fits so perfectly with neoliberalism, is that the home is sacred. Women will be inside it. the public sphere is being drained, and there's less and less of a sense of a civil society. It's really, the state and then the domus. And that happened very fast. And I guess part of what we're hearing today is how fast context collapse is happening and how we're living at a pace. I mean, I wouldn't have expected that, but the right wing is using the idea of privacy as a very restrictive, regressive idea.
That's a lot to synthesize. We're technically out of time, so I wonder if anyone has some kind of closing thoughts, you're welcome to. Otherwise, we can, I think they were very good. Those questions function as good commentaries and observations as well, so we can continue the conversation over coffee, I think. So if you do have a punctuation.
Okay, well, if you don't mind, yeah, I'll answer the first question in the back real quick, which is just that, I mean, certainly when I talk to people, I encourage people to do their research and kind of take these measures into their own hands, and if they want to use various privacy-enhancing tools, I think there's nothing wrong with that. To me, it's definitely the political education that can attend that process that is most important. And I think you mentioned also something about, well, what if kind of everyone starts cracking down on their own, or securing their own personal privacy, or one example might be, what might happen then, one example might be the use of ad blockers, which has really improved some people's browsing experiences and makes you hard to track, depending on what you're using, but also impacts some very good publishers who need that kind of ad revenue. I think the larger point is that individuals can certainly do a lot, and enough individuals working together, that becomes a movement. But the companies and governments who are controlling these technologies are definitely in the position of power and advantage, and I just don't really see that changing as long as we're kind of operating on their terms. It sort of becomes this arms race of how can you be a more responsible consumer or citizen, and how can you support the right policies and use these tools. But then you're always, these companies are always looking to supervise you more, to make the surveillance more granular and more specific. So it does seem to me like kind of a battle that can't fully be won. It doesn't mean it's not worth fighting, and perhaps worth fighting in other fields like the courts and the law. And one other question, the question about privacy kind of being used to protect the powerful, I think is interesting also. Just for example, the other day, and this will be my last comment, but there was yet another incident of a young man being thrown off a plane for speaking Arabic. And one of the interesting things that I saw was Southwest didn't really comment. That was the airline. They gave a boilerplate answer about how they're following the proper procedures and they were working with government, which essentially says we're following the algorithm we have in this situation. It's the same way that automated systems displace responsibility onto the algorithm. They said, we follow procedures. But then the other thing that they said was, to preserve his privacy, we're not going to comment further on the case, or on the incident, to preserve the privacy of the man who's thrown off the plane. So this is the kind of thing we see now a lot, where you kind of have almost like a HIPAA medical attitude about privacy being applied to these other situations where we're told it's in our best interests or in the best interests of the person who's actually the victim to keep certain information private. And so I think that's something we really need to be on guard for, this way in which, the meaning of privacy kind of gets repurposed or it gets recast through this business, corporate speak, in order to protect powerful people.
And you, very quickly.
I'll be quick. It's one of the other cases we worked on that pulls together several of the themes. We were involved in the litigation to remove the backscatter X-ray devices from U.S. airports. These were the devices that allowed the transportation security officials to see airline passengers basically stripped naked. Now, point one, the U.S. airports have become the front line in trying to defend the country against the invasive other. And to your point, if you want to see where the greatest inroads have been made into classifying, identifying, profiling, probing, it is in the U.S. airport. That's where that occurs. To your question, what is personal? It's being tested, you see. Because when you seek physical entry into the United States, a great part of what's happening is the government's demand for you to give up what you would have considered to be personal. Not only the shape of your body, but also who you're traveling with, what your religion is, which countries you visited to. All of this becomes a key point. And I think to your point on distance, I mean, this at least gives us the moment, the space, the snapshot to understand what that type of intrusion looks like. And then the question we ask, of course, how much of the rest of the country begins to resemble those kinds of screening techniques that we've accepted on a daily basis.
I mean, we haven't mentioned cybernetics, and I think that is behind all of this. There's a sort of science of control, communication. I think that's part of it too.
And just a quick word. How do we understand distance? It's definitely not physical. And to me, the question is not so much how far as ideas traveled, but what kind of walls we're putting them, we're establishing to push them back. And what historically, I think, the study of freedom of expression and freedom of conscience demonstrated that actually they never traveled that much. You know, they are often from within, the ideas that are being pushed or fenced against, as the Uganda example was highlighting. The walls are created from within. I just wanted to finish on a more positive note. Yes, there is a crisis in Europe around the state and the right wing, but I do not believe that civil society has disappeared. I mean, it's everywhere. There are protests every day. In France, there were a huge protest in London. There are protests in Macedonia. Everybody's on the street, maybe not always for the right reason, always the big vision of where they want to go with their protest. Look at Brazil. I mean, people have, I think there is a crisis of electoral democracy, that for sure. And people in Europe and elsewhere, I mean, Brazil is an example. It's, you do have a lot of people taking to the street to express their voice, to communicate their ideas, because they feel that electoral democracy is not working.
But do demonstrations now work as they sometimes did in the past?
We don't know that.
We don't know that yet.
It's an open question, and we can leave it open. And just to say that you can demonstrate online, that there is a concept of online protest, that there is digital protest. So I just say, let's be a bit more positive for positive changes. It may not happen overnight with all those right-wing people on the move as well, getting power. But I'm personally always very grateful for civil society and for the power of the idea, the progressive one.
Wonderful. And so I think next year we should have the invasive self, just to balance the other. But for now, please thank the panel who